Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at something you've sent over.
Oh,
Two U.S. State Department visa bulletins.
right.
One from December 2024 and one from January 2025.
Okay.
Now, I know these bulletins can seem like kind of dry government documents,
Yeah.
but trust me, they're actually windows into the world of U.S. immigration.
Really?
Think of it like this.
Yeah.
These bulletins tell us who can apply for an immigrant visa, and just as importantly, when.
What's fascinating here is that these bulletins are more than just static lists.
Right.
They really reflect global trends, economic shifts, and even the impact of recent legislation.
So today we're going to compare these two bulletins side by side.
Okay.
See what's changed.
Yeah.
Try to understand what these shifts might mean for people hoping to immigrate to the U.S.
Sounds good.
I'm curious, what jumps out at you right away when you compare these two bulletins?
Well, one of the most striking changes is in the family-sponsored preferences,
Okay.
specifically the F2A category.
Now, for those unfamiliar,
Yeah.
this category covers spouses and children of green card holders.
Right.
In the December bulletin, the cutoff date for those born in Mexico was April 15th, 2021.
Okay.
But in the January bulletin, this category becomes current.
Current.
Yeah.
That's a big leap. What could be driving such a significant shift for this specific category?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It could be that more visas became available,
Okay.
or perhaps the backlog for Mexican applicants in this category eased.
Yeah.
Whatever the reason, it's certainly good news for families who have been waiting to be reunited.
Now, I know these bulletins can be a bit confusing with their different categories and dates.
Right.
Before we dive deeper, could you explain the various family-sponsored preference categories for our listener?
Certainly, you have categories F1 through F4.
Okay.
F1 is for the unmarried sons and daughters of U.S. citizens.
Got it.
F2, as we mentioned, is for spouses and children,
Right.
as well as unmarried sons and daughters of green card holders.
With F2A specifically for spouses and children, and F2B covering the unmarried sons and daughters.
Okay.
F3 is for the married sons and daughters of U.S. citizens.
Okay.
And finally, F4 is for brothers and sisters of adult U.S. citizens.
Okay, so those are the categories.
Right.
But then within each category, we have two sets of dates.
Yes.
Final action dates and dates for filing applications.
Uh-huh.
For someone completely new to this, how would you explain the difference?
Think of it like this.
Okay.
The final action date is the date when the U.S. government will actually make a decision on your visa application.
Okay.
If your priority date,
Yeah.
which is the date your petition was initially filed,
Got it.
is earlier than the final action date listed, you're eligible to have your application adjudicated.
So that's the date you're really aiming for.
Right.
But what about the dates for filing applications?
That date is more about getting your paperwork ready.
Okay.
Sometimes, if there are enough visas available, you'll be allowed to submit your application based on the dates for filing applications,
Okay.
which are usually earlier than the final action dates.
Right.
This gives people a heads up to gather their documents and prepare their application.
Yeah.
It helps manage the flow.
Okay, so it's like a two-step process.
Exactly.
You become eligible to apply,
Right.
and then you wait until your final action date to actually get a decision.
Correct.
Interesting. Now, we've talked about family-sponsored visas,
Right.
but what about people coming to the U.S. for work?
Uh-huh.
What did you notice in the employment-based categories?
Well, one notable shift is in the EB3 category,
Yeah.
specifically for other workers.
Gotcha.
This category covers skilled workers, professionals,
Right.
and other workers who don't fall into the more specialized EB categories.
Gotcha.
For most countries, the final action date moved forward by a week,
Okay.
from December 1st, 2020 to December 8th, 2020.
A week's movement. Is that significant in this context?
It might not seem like much, but even a week can be meaningful when you've been waiting for years.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that there's an annual quota of 10,000 visas for other workers.
Right.
And that quota is further impacted by other factors, such as legislation.
Legislation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, for example, the Nicaraguan and Central American Relief Act,
Okay.
or NACARA,
Got it.
allows certain Nicaraguans and Central Americans to adjust their status.
Okay.
And that draws from the same pool of other workers' visas.
So it's not just about the overall number of visas available,
Right.
but also how those visas are allocated between different programs.
Exactly.
That makes things even more complex, doesn't it?
Precisely. For fiscal year 2025, about 150 visas are being diverted to NACURA adjustments.
Wow.
To put it in perspective,
Yeah.
imagine you're waiting in the EB3 other workers line,
Yeah.
and suddenly 150 people cut in line ahead of you.
Oh, wow.
It can definitely impact the wait times for everyone else.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It helps to really visualize the impact of these legislative changes. Okay, so we've covered family-sponsored and employment-based preferences.
Right.
Before we jump into the diversity visa lottery,
Okay.
let's shift gears for a moment and talk about special cases.
Yes, there are a few unique situations outlined in these bulletins that we should highlight.
What caught your eye?
Well, one interesting case involves the employment fourth preference category for religious workers,
Okay.
also known as the SR category.
Got it.
This category is scheduled to expire on December 20th, 2024.
Expire. So after that date, no new SR visas will be issued.
That's correct, unless there's further legislative action to extend it.
Oh, wow.
It's a bit of a waiting game for those applicants.
So they're in limbo, hoping for an extension.
Exactly.
Are there any other special cases we should be aware of?
Yes. The bulletins also mention some potential changes in the EB5 category,
Okay.
which is for investors seeking permanent residency through job creation.
Ah, the investor visa. What's happening there?
Both the Department of State and USCIS are seeing a surge in EB5 applications,
Okay.
particularly in the set-aside categories for investments in rural areas, high unemployment areas, and infrastructure projects.
Got it.
They're monitoring the situation closely
Oh,
and might have to establish final action dates or dates for filing applications to manage the flow and stay within the annual limits.
so even within the EB5 category,
Yeah.
there are nuances and potential bottlenecks to be aware of.
Absolutely.
Anything else in this special cases section that we should flag for our listeners?
One more thing.
Yeah.
The National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA,
Yep.
for fiscal year 2024,
Okay.
has some provisions that could impact U.S. government employee special immigrant visas, or SIVs.
Okay.
It introduces new requirements and qualifications for certain SIV applicants.
So even if your priority date is current, based on the visa bulletin, you might still face hurdles due to these new NDAA provisions.
That's right. It's a bit complex.
So it's not enough to just track the visa bulletin.
Right.
You have to stay informed about relevant legislation as well.
Exactly.
It sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It certainly is, and that's why it's so important to have resources like these bulletins to help you navigate the complexities.
Absolutely. And of course, the deep dive is here to help break it all down. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's move on to the diversity visa lottery and see what changes, if any, stand out between these two bulletins. Then we'll try to connect all of these dots and figure out what these shifts might tell us about the bigger picture of U.S. immigration.
The Diversity Visa Lottery, or DV Lottery as it's often called, is all about diversifying the pool of immigrants coming to the U.S. It's a lottery system that awards visas to people from countries with historically lower rates of immigration to the U.S.
It's a fascinating program. And looking at these two bulletins, we see some pretty significant shifts in the regional cutoff numbers between December and January.
Yes, take the Africa region, for example. The December cutoff was 15,000, meaning if your lottery number was below, that you were eligible to apply. But in January, that cutoff jumped all the way up to 22,500.
Wow, that's a big increase. So in January, many more people from the African region with lottery numbers under 22,500 could potentially apply. I wonder what factors might be driving that shift.
It's difficult to say for sure, but it could be related to changes in demand or processing capacity, or perhaps even a reflection of global events influencing migration patterns. It's a good reminder that these bulletins are constantly in flux, reacting to a multitude of factors.
Right, and it's not just about being eligible to apply. Remember, those diversity visas are time sensitive. They expire if they're not used by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30, 2025. That puts a lot of pressure on those applicants.
Absolutely. It creates a sense of urgency. In addition to navigating the complexities of the application process, they're also racing against the clock.
You know, looking at all of these changes across different categories, it makes you realize how much is packed into these bulletins. It's not just data points. It's about real people. Dreams, delayed lives put on hold. It really brings home the human impact of these seemingly bureaucratic documents.
You've hit the nail on the head. Imagine the emotional roller coaster for a family in Mexico waiting for their spouse or child to join them in the U.S. They see the F2A category become current for January, and it's a moment of immense relief of hope rekindled.
It's like a weight has been lifted. But for others, seeing their categories stagnate or even retrogress can be incredibly disheartening. It's a reminder that behind these numbers are real families, real hopes, and sometimes real heartbreak.
And that human impact extends beyond those directly applying for visas. Think about the employers who are sponsoring highly skilled workers through the employment-based categories. If those dates are moving slowly, it could mean delays in filling critical positions, potentially impacting businesses and even the broader economy.
So it's not just about individual lives, it's about the ripple effects these delays can have on industries and the economy as a whole. We talked earlier about how legislation can impact visa availability. Could you give an example of how that plays out in the real world, using these bulletins as a guide?
We've already touched on how NICARA, the Nicaraguan and Central American Relief Act, affects the EB3 Other Workers category. Remember, that act allows certain Nicaraguans and Central Americans to adjust their status, and that draws from the same limited pool of visas available for the Other Workers category.
Right, so that's a clear example of how a law can directly impact the number of visas available for other applicants. What about the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act that we mentioned earlier? How might that legislation affect the special immigrant visas for U.S. government employees who worked abroad?
Well, the NDAA introduced some new requirements and qualifications for certain SIV applicants. It's a bit complex, but essentially it adds another layer of complexity for those individuals.
So even if your priority date is current, based on the visa bulletin, you might still face additional hurdles because of these new NDAA provisions. It's almost like the goalposts have shifted.
That's a good way to put it. It reinforces the importance of staying informed about any legislative changes that might affect your specific situation. It's not enough to just check the visa bulletin. You need to be aware of the broader legal landscape.
Okay, so we've walked through the key changes in these two visa bulletins, from family-sponsored preferences to employment-based visas, the diversity visa lottery, and even these special cases. It's a lot to digest. But if we try to zoom out a bit, what broader trends in U.S. immigration do these changes reflect?
One overarching trend is the increasing demand for visas across many categories. The backlogs are growing, wait times are extending. It's a reflection of global migration patterns, economic factors, and U.S. immigration policies all intertwined.
It's like trying to solve a giant puzzle with all of these pieces interacting and impacting each other. We're seeing a rise in asylum seekers at the southern border, ongoing debates about border security and immigration reform. All of these issues feed into how visas are allocated and processed.
And we can't forget about the economic factors at play. A strong U.S. economy often attracts more immigrants seeking job opportunities, while global economic downturns can influence migration patterns as well. It's a complex interplay of forces.
So these visa bulletins are really just one small window into this much larger, constantly evolving world of U.S. immigration. They're a snapshot in time reflecting the dynamic and often contentious nature of these policies.
Precisely. And what we see in December and January might be completely different in the months to come. It's a reminder that these bulletins are not static. They're living documents constantly adapting to the world around them.
It's amazing how these bulletins, which on the surface seem purely informational, can reveal so much about global trends, economic shifts, and the human impact of immigration policies.
It's like holding up a mirror to the world, isn't it?
Exactly. So before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to shift the focus to you, our listener.
What stood out to you from our conversation today? What sparked your curiosity? What questions are you still pondering?
Because ultimately, this deep dive is about empowering you with knowledge and insights. Whether you're personally affected by these visa bulletins or just curious about U.S. immigration, we hope this conversation has shed light on this complex process.
And maybe even sparked a desire to learn more.
Now, before we go, we'd like to leave you with a final thought, something to consider as you continue to explore this topic.
How do you think global events, economic trends, or even political debates might influence future visa bulletins?
That's a great question to ponder. It reminds us how interconnected this all is. We've seen how legislation like NACRA and the NDAA directly impacts visa availability. And as we've discussed, economic shifts, global migration patterns, and even political climates can all play a role.
It's a reminder that these bulletins are not just about numbers and dates. They're a reflection of the world around us.
So if you're following along at home, pay attention to the news, stay informed about policy changes, and keep an eye on global trends. Because events happening thousands of miles away can have a ripple effect, ultimately influencing who gets to come to the U.S. and when.
It's all about recognizing that we're part of a global community, and these immigration policies, these visa bulletins, are a tangible representation of that interconnectedness.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
And on that note, we encourage you to visit the State Department's website for the most up-to-date information on visa bulletins and other immigration-related resources.
As we've seen today, things can change quickly.
Absolutely. And we'll be here ready to dive into the next set of bulletins whenever those changes come. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. It's amazing how these bulletins, which on the surface seem, purely informational,
Yeah.
can reveal so much about global trends, economic shifts,
Yeah.
and the human impact of immigration policies.
It's like holding up a mirror to the world, isn't it?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to kind of shift the focus to you, our listener.
Okay.
What stood out to you from our conversation today?
Yeah, what sparked your curiosity? What questions are you still pondering?
Because ultimately, this deep dive is about empowering you with knowledge and insights. Whether you're personally affected by these visa bulletins or just curious about U.S. immigration, we hope this conversation has shed some light on this complex process.
Yeah, and maybe even sparked a desire to learn more.
Now, before we go, we'd like to leave you with a final thought, something to consider as you continue to explore this topic.
How do you think global events, economic trends, or even political debates might influence future visa bulletins?
That's a great question to ponder. It reminds us how interconnected this all is. We've seen how legislation like NACRA and the NDAA directly impacts visa availability. And as we've discussed, economic shifts, global migration patterns, and even political climates can all play a role.
It's a reminder that these bulletins are not just about numbers and dates. They're a reflection of the world around us.
So if you're following along at home, pay attention to the news, stay informed about policy changes, and keep an eye on global trends. Because events happening thousands of miles away can have a ripple effect, ultimately influencing who gets to come to the U.S. and when.
It's all about recognizing that we're part of a global community, and
Right.
these immigration policies, these visa bulletins, are a tangible representation of that interconnectedness.
That's a powerful way to put it. And on that note, we encourage you to visit the State Department's website for the most up-to-date information on visa bulletins and other immigration-related resources.
As we've seen today, things can change quickly.
Absolutely. And we'll be here ready to dive into the next set of bulletins whenever those changes come. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.